All right, I am excited to jump into Sugarless again, and we are doing chapter 3. Chapter 3 is titled Sugar is Addictive. And if you remember from the introduction, we talked about the author Nicole Avena and how she's done so many studies with the brain, and that even her foreword is written by a psychiatrist. And she is from Princeton University and has done so much studying in her undergrad and her graduate degree with the brain and sugar. So now that is now how we are going to get into the meat of it, into the meat of what she is talking about, with sugar being this being a science and psychology book and not a diet book. She was very, very clear about that in the introduction. And so here we are going to talk about why that is. So she starts off by talking about the 1980s. In the 1980s, I even remember in the 90s growing up and having that very prominent egg commercial about addiction and drugs. And it said, "This is your brain." And then it cracked open the egg, and the egg went into the frying pan, and it said, "This is your brain on drugs." A very vivid picture. And of course, it was a campaign to keep Americans off of drugs and not to become addicted. She makes the claim in this chapter that this is our brain on sugar. Okay, a very bold claim. So we're going to dig into that a little bit here. She says that doctors agree that people can become addicted to activities such as gambling, video games, and yes, even sugar. What's interesting about this is doctors actually make a very big distinction between rewarding, what is a rewarding, and what is addictive, okay, and what is addicting. So in the diagnostic manual, the DSM, gambling is recognized as an addictive as addiction, a gambling addiction. Okay, that is something that you can get diagnosed with. Gaming, on the other hand, is kind of like a gaming disorder. So they are noticing that it is a gaming disorder. However, sugar, they're not putting it there yet, okay, at least. But she does go over the studies, and she is going to try and prove her case here in chapter 3 about why it belongs there alongside gambling and video gaming. And with that, she does talk about in the appendix, one of the things that is really awesome about this book is the appendix is full of information. It is full of recipes and a whole bunch of links to studies and different names of sugars. And one of the things she has in the appendix is this criteria shown for what would classify as an addiction. And so it says, "Are you addicted to sugar?" That, and it lists 13 questions in the appendix that you can do a self-assessment and see if your sugar habit is rising to the level of an addiction. Okay, so I did this, but I did not notice that I was answering these questions for coffee. I mean, for sugar. Actually, for me, it was coffee. And so out of 13 questions, I probably answered 11 of them to have an addiction to coffee. So very eye-opening. I can't say I was super surprised, but it's very interesting how what I'm feeling is an issue with coffee can be described um, very with a questionnaire. So anyway, so it said 6 or more questions, severe addiction, and I think I answered like 11 out of 13. Anyway, so if you are struggling with something that is food related, then definitely check out the appendix in this book. All right, so with that being said, back to sugar, she talks about sugar being part of the reward system, okay? And she says, here's the crazy part. The reward system that is activated by drugs and to make them addicting is the same system that is activated by the foods we eat. She says we don't have a cocaine system or an alcohol system or a cupcake system. It's all one system, a reward system. And then she makes a very bold statement. Our brain doesn't know if we're shooting heroin or eating a cupcake. And I just think that's such a strong statement. We know what drug addiction does to a lot of people. There is massive chemical effects of drug addiction. There's intense physical withdrawals. There's danger or intense physical dependency. There's intense physical withdrawals, psychological withdrawals, dangerous withdrawals. There's an overdose risk, and there's major changes in brain function. So I don't want to minimize what she's talking about here on sugar. If you read chapter 1 or go back to my video on chapter 1, we know that sugar is the cause of diabetes. It's linked to Alzheimer's, which they're calling diabetes type 3, cardiovascular disease, cancer. Okay, so there are some real consequences for consuming the amount of sugar that we are consuming in this country. But does it rise to the level of heroin? And does our brain really not know the difference? Again, chapter 3 here, she's going to make that case. One thing that I found extremely interesting since I was in college and studying some psychology is rats. We always are using rats to study, and I would think like rats are the furthest thing from a human. Why are we studying on rats? So she demystifies that a little bit for me. And she talks about how rats and mice are commonly used in the research setting because their neural circuitry are similar to humans. And in addition to that, rats do not have some of those outside influences. Like a rat is not going to care how they're going to look at a couple of months in that bikini on the beach, right? And so they don't have self-esteem pressures, they don't have environmental pressures, they don't have media and culture and all these things. So you can really isolate the neural pathways and the brain system that is going on with the rats. And that is why rats are a good model of the human brain and the way we respond to certain things. So she's going to go through many studies about binging, withdrawing, and cravings. Those are 3 things that we all associate with addiction, right? Binging, withdrawal, and cravings. And she talks about many studies in that. And so if you are interested, if you are sciencey and you want to read these studies, there are phenomenal ones. I'm not going to go over all of them. I do want to say she talks about one where it compares sugar to cocaine and a direct comparison there. And there's another one where she talks about a light bulb, and they kind of use the light bulb to mimic advertising or mimic driving by your favorite donut shop in the morning, and how that plays into addiction and craving and everything as well. So very, very interesting. The one that I did want to really bring up is the one where she talks about dopamine. Now, we've heard a lot about dopamine in recent years, even scrolling on TikTok, right? Scrolling on Facebook, we're finding that that's giving off a lot of dopamine in our brains. And so what she explains is that when we eat food, it also has a dopamine response, but we're not supposed to, our ancestors did not have, and we're not supposed to have a dopamine release every time we eat. That really it is for when we have new or exciting foods. So the first time you ever taste something, or like I went to a really good Indian restaurant and it was delicious, and I don't think I've had Indian food, in my lifetime. And so that dopamine, and it was to keep our ancestors either going back to nutritious and good food and helping them remember, or if they got sick or poisoned, then that dopamine would also help them not go back to that food. So what this study examined was they took rats that were hooked on sugar. So whatever way they determined that the rat was hooked on sugar, and it showed that their brain released dopamine every time they drank it. And then they took rats that was like their control group that had only had sugar once in a while, and they found that their brains treated sugar like any other food, and it only released dopamine on the initial exposure, and then after that the sugar no longer released the dopamine. And so I thought that was really insightful to know that our brains can act differently depending on if we're addicted to sugar, or we're showing that dependency on sugar, or if we just enjoy sugar once in a while here or there, and that there's actually some chemical reaction going on in the brain with that. So very interesting. I love this book because from the beginning, she was very clear that she wasn't just going to give us the problem with no hope. And I don't like it when I feel hopeless or helpless, but she's going to help us dig into what we can do about the problem. So stay with me for chapter 4. It is breaking your dependence on sugar. I'm excited to see what she says.